Thank you for having me here. So let me just tell you just real quickly about my background, because I think that, you know, as you guys are dealing with how to get information and how your students are processing the information and where they're getting it from, they should know what the source is and what their biases are. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pass around these. These are little sheets about the Katy Prairie, and I'll pass around these as well. I'll start them over here. And then what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take this card stack and take 5 cards each. And we're going to use this later on. Don't do anything with these. Don't, you know, start any kind of off-market betting or anything like that. Just take 5 cards and then pass the stack until we're out of those. So let me just tell you, as we're passing this stuff out, let me just mention that it is wonderful and intimidating to go after Andy and Mark, in that I'm always learning stuff from them, but I always feel a little bit kind of, you know. There's multiple things coming around. Yeah, let me just tell you about where I'm coming from. And there's a lot of stuff going out. I'm an educator, so we're going to do a couple of activities. So I get to have a job where I get to do ecological restoration both out in the countryside, on the Katy Prairie, and also I get to do restoration in the middle of the city. Let's let everybody pass everything out, and then we'll go ahead and get started, I think. Nope, just leave those right in the middle. Just leave those as a set. Yeah, I mean, if you pass, that's great. We're going to reassemble them here in a little bit. Just take the poker cards. If there are any poker cards left over, Rowena, just go ahead and pass them out randomly to people. So basically, I get to do ecological restoration, and that's a lot of fun. And I get to do it both in the rural environment and the middle of the city. And we'll talk about why we do it in the middle of the city. I also have 3 other parts of my job. One is I'm the primary educator for the Katy Prairie Conservancy, so I teach everybody from pre-K to postdoctoral students. I lecture at universities, and then I go to, you know, a homeschool. So, you know, I get to see all these different folks and all these different contexts. I also, as part of my job, I do a lot of collaborative work. So I put together networks of people that work together for various and sundry environmental things. And one of the things that I was able to do several years ago with a colleague is put together something called the Coastal Prairie Partnership. Basically, that was founded to basically get the prairie community to work more closely together, to know each other, to leverage resources, to go after joint funding, all of that stuff. And then I do a lot of creative content delivery, like videography and graphic design and all that stuff. So I get to touch a lot of the pieces of what it looks like to save ecosystems and to tell the story. So my talk is going to be probably a little bit different, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about one particular project we have going on at the Indian Grass Preserve, which takes into account what you've been hearing today. And so I think if you got one thing out of these talks this morning, is that the most important phrase in ecology is, or a restoration and that kind of thing, is it depends. There is no cookie cutter. There's no recipe book to go to in order to figure out all this stuff out. There is just, and people want us to do this all the time. Like, I'll have a landowner like, give me all the specific steps I need to do in which order. It's like, well, it depends. What do you have? Andy said something really important at the tail end of his talk, which was that these academics, not these academics, I have a great amount of respect for academics. They do really incredible work. But if you take somebody like a Mark Kramer or Andy Sipitz, what they're seeing, they're getting repetitions on the land. Okay? This is no different. My best friend is an emergency room doctor. And the longer he is away on vacation, the rustier his surgery skills get. It just happens. If he were away for it long enough, he wouldn't know what he's looking at quite as sharply. And it's the same thing with ecologists. The more they sit behind a desk, the rustier they get. And you have to see a specific piece of land over and over and over and over again through droughts and floods and cycling and grazing and fire in order to get even a basic sense of what that is. But what I will tell you is that it's way more complicated than that and way more easy in certain ways. And that is because there are many, many things we don't know. So we have to operate in an environment of partial ignorance and know that and be comfortable living there, while at the same time taking some positive action, not knowing exactly what's going to happen. So there's a lot of uncertainty. That's why when Mark was saying, you know, you'll ask 8 best prairie ecologists in this area, how do you do X, Y, Z, or what should you do, or here's a piece of property, what do you think I should do? You probably get a lot of different answers. I'll talk to you about cattle later on and how we use cattle, because we do use cattle, and we think that if they're used properly, they're actually a real benefit. So let me just show you a couple of resources. So here's Katy Prairie Conservancy's website. We do have some information about prairies there at katyprairie.org. We're at Land Trust, so we save land. And we've protected about 20,000 acres, which is not the biggest land trust in the world. It's not like it's Nature Conservancy. But 20,000 acres is big enough so that you know that you could fit all of Manhattan Island and 2 memorial parks here in Houston on that property. Once you get to that size, and then you have adjoining lands that are wild, you start to get to big ecology, right? You start to get to having enough room for some very large ecological processes to start to occur. Another thing I wanted to point out real quickly, and this is still very much under development, is that we're putting together, and for you guys who are here, how many of you are from the greater Houston area? All right, so most of you. So we're hoping to get a little bit more funding for this because we kind of ran out of money last year. But there's something called Here in Houston that we've led on, which is basically an attempt to get all these environmental and ecological resources together for teachers in one spot. We've been asking you guys to be archaeologists for a long time, to like sift through the internet and come up with all these things. That's a mess. So it's been our fault that we didn't get you this stuff. So as a certified teacher, 4th through 8 science, and I teach at the College of Ed at U of H sometimes, I know it's very difficult on the daily for you guys to get what you need to teach. And so we want to make this easier. If we get some funding for this, we're also going to have some teacher training in terms of teaching about your local ecoregion. How do you do it? Where do you do it? Where do you get the resources? What are the publications? All that stuff. So anyway, this is very much a work in progress, but the Coastal Prairie module, which I've put together, is mostly complete. So there are lessons here. There are printables, shareables, maps, soundscapes from local prairies that we've done, downloadable photos, videos, content, and links to other content. So I just wanted to point that out because this is a very complicated story, even when you're talking about one ecosystem like the Coastal Prairie. And then last thing I want to show you is the Coastal Prairie Partnership real quick, which is that organization that can help link you if you want to do service on a coastal prairie or other things regarding prairies, or if you want to connect with other people in the prairie community. This is a really good agency. So with that said, let me go ahead and get into the presentation. And basically, I'm going to tell you exactly what I tell people on any tour that I do of the prairie. And that is this. I can take this tour at any time. This is your tour. This is not my tour. Okay? So stop me if I'm talking too fast and ask me the question. You're here to get answers from me, not the other way around. But we are going to learn together as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the ecosystem has changed in very broad strokes. We're not going to get super detailed because we don't have a lot of time before lunch. But I will say this. What we know about the Coastal Prairie, the general broad statement, is way less than what we don't know. Okay, we're operating, like I said, in a realm of partial ignorance, but knowing that if we do nothing, then the patient, which is the coastal prairie, will die. Okay, so this is like a doctor who doesn't quite know what's happening with the patient, but they know they better start doing something or that patient's going to expire. So recognize that. And the reason I'm telling you that is this. When I first started doing this stuff, and I've had a cold all week, so that's why my voice is kind of weak. When we first started doing this stuff, I talked to a lot of people, including Mark and Andy and other folks, and they're not the ones that I'm talking about here. There were a certain cluster of prairie ecologists who were like, you know what? The horses left the barn with the prairie, the coastal prairie. It's not worth it. It's done. You finished. Move on to something. Go have a margarita. Move on to something else. And it's because they felt like there had already been enough change, or we didn't know enough to actually have an impact. Okay? So recognize that what Mark was saying is absolutely true. You ask a whole bunch of ecologists in a room what to do, and you're going to get a whole bunch of different answers. But there are some things that we've learned. So I oftentimes show this picture to folks, and I say that this picture is highly inaccurate. It's a beautiful picture, right? But always be very critical about the information you're looking at, right? What's highly, highly inaccurate about this picture? No? All those species did exist in that. And this is a little further north prairie.
The grass is way too short.
Yeah, well, it could be if there's a buffalo herd going through there. Something that you might not think about.
The root systems are really...
No. Where is it?
People?
No people. This is a baloney argument right here. Okay. This is a very hurtful picture, and I'll tell you why. Because if you figure that people are not part of ecosystems, then you will start making very bad critical errors. Because you're basing it on an assumption that is not true. So for the coastal prairie in specific, people have always been a part of that ecosystem since it's been assembled. And there's some debate as to whether it was assembled about 10,000 or 7,000 years ago. But here's the main point. People have always been a keystone animal on the coastal prairie. We don't put people into pictures like this because we see ourselves as separate from nature. That's a falsehood. In fact, the whole term pristine, I want you to take that, crunch it up into a ball, and throw it away. It's a meaningless concept in ecology nowadays. There is no ecosystem on the planet that is not touched by people. Not one. Not a single inch of ground. Think climate change, but also think plastic pollutions and all that stuff. So if we're going to be ecologists, we have to be mindful of the fact that we operate in a system where humans are the dominant keystone species in many of these ecosystems. Now, a lot of people hear that and they hate it because they've been encultured from the Wilderness Act on to believe that pristine, pure nature is without people. Look at the Wilderness Act discussion. And those without it are degraded and therefore not worth anything. We're going to get back to that. Here's why we know. So when they were building Highway 99 up through the Katy Prairie, they found these points. These points are being stabilized down in Corpus Christi right now by Dr. Jason Barrett. It's hard to read this, but if you look at F, this point right here, and you look at the date, anybody read that? Barely. 10,650 years before present. We always talk about Houston being a new place. Baloney for people. They've been here for over 10,000 years. And they were impacting the environment that whole time. In fact, one of the ways that they impacted that environment is they caused a trophic cascade at the end of the last ice age. What is a trophic cascade? Anybody?
Well, it's basically an area where there's going from different, a lot of things at the top are going down. The energy pyramid is just collapsing because of mass extinction.
So there's something that's gone extinct. And sometimes it can just be one animal. Like think Yellowstone and wolves, right? and all the massive changes that ping-ponged around. But at the end of the last, and these folks right here are the Karankawa, who have a very bad reputation, kind of in a very inaccurate way. But people have been here for a long time. In fact, and this is one of the uncertainties about doing projects like this, is when I first started, people said, well, let's get back to pre-Columbian conditions. Let's get back to 1491 with this project. That is an impossibility for a number of reasons. But it's partially an impossibility because we didn't have good enough records. We didn't have any records in 1491 to tell us what was here. But it's also an impossibility because we have taken away one of the primary forces of the coastal prairie. Native Americans. They played a role, like Andy was talking about, in terms of fire production. And so even before, and I want you to put this in your brain, even before Anglo settlers from the Deep South and from Europe came here to settle this area, the prairie ecosystem had already started to shift in ways that we can't understand. And why is that? Well, we know that European diseases traveled up trade channels and were nailing Indian communities up here in the 1700s. So we had already started to change the dynamic because that keystone animal, humans, started to be affected heavily. In some of these populations, 90% of the folks that were wiped out. 95% of the folks that were wiped out. So when we found Indians here, we found a very depauperate population of Indians, and we thought, oh, there's not very many people who live here, and they're a relic population of what was around before those European issues. But let's talk trophic cascade. This is a picture of what this neighborhood, and this is further down the coast, but we had all of these species here at the end of the Ice Age. Lions, cheetahs. This is a grassland complex that was called the American Serengeti. Very complicated. But it was full of these huge grazing animals. We're finding mammoth on some of our properties. So once you start to change the herbivores and the carnivore system in a grassland like this, you start to have massive changes. And what we see in the historical record is there have been these outbursts of extinction on the coastal prairie, right? So at the end of the Ice Age, you really, and it wasn't really the coastal prairie at that point, but all of these grass species, many of them were here already, like Andy was pointing out. So you start to see this trophic cascade issue. Then you get to, the early, or the 1830s, the last buffalo herd spotted around here, of any number, about 5,000 near Lamarck. Then you start to lose other pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. Here's one that was lost here rather recently. So this is a bone clone. It's not a real skull, but you can pass it around. This was our native wolf. It wasn't a gray wolf, right? It was a red wolf. When you start to understand that we had jaguar accounts on our prairies in the early 1800s, and then we had red wolves here, and we had other creatures, what you start to see, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much, is you start to see that there has been a shifting baseline in terms of what's potentially possible for wildlife, even before we start to think about restoring anything. And therefore, that's going to really impact the plant communities that we may or may not have. That moth example in Yucca is perfect. We don't know how these other animals impacted the prairie in a scientific way. In a gross way, yes, the buffalo and whatnot, but in a kind of a measured scientific way, we don't really know. Here's another thing to add to the pot, and Andy talked about this. Here's the picture of the original ecological heritage of the area. This is from Houston Wilderness. So you can see the tan area is coastal prairie, and then we had all the associated other ecosystems in the region. And my map differs from this because we use several maps to combine it, but we also have historical accounts where I've listed prairie on Galveston Island and other places that kind of more pinged it there. But really, this is a map of Houston too. This is from the late 1800s. This is how commercial interests saw Houston. They saw those ecosystems and they thought, This is where we get resources. Okay? So, there were huge fig and satsuma orchards here. Rice on the Katy Prairie, right? Melons up in Hempstead. If you think about a lot of our social, cultural things, like the Pasadena Rice Harvest or Strawberry Festival, and all these different things, they're all kind of based on agriculture. And agriculture started to shift the ecological community pretty quickly. So one of the things to think about is that there were both intended uses, like these crops and cattle grazing and other things, and unintended consequences that we're having to measure and deal with and think about. And this is, who's not from Houston? Someone's from Dallas, is that right?
Rio Grande Valley.
Rio Grande Valley. So if you take a look at this picture, this is from a book by David Todd, my friend, and this is the original grasslands in Texas. And it makes a heck of a lot of sense. Had we come to a state that was all trees, guess what? There would be no such thing as a Texas cowboy. Cows don't eat trees. Okay, a lot of this was open range. And, you know, Mark was talking about that Bastrop fire jumping the Colorado. We have counts from the 1800s of fire starting up here and going all the way down here. So once we started to break this up with agriculture, that also started to change the dynamic. Okay, so there's a lot of different pieces to this puzzle. It's very complicated. And so when we look at the history of, and I'll say this because I'm a storyteller, when we look at the history of politics, race relations, everything, it's really based on land use. A lot of the economic development of Houston was on land use. Okay? So people sometimes say, oh, the prairie is a very subtle ecosystem. Baloney. We've fought wars over it. We have issues like slavery that were fought over it. We have Texas icons that were born on it. Our foodways, our barbecue, our music, all that stuff, it's very not subtle. It is exactly smack you in the face. Okay? These prairie ecosystems are critically important, not just scientifically and ecologically, but also culturally, and to know where you live in the world. Okay? I also say that it's a really important, you know, if you've ever wondered why Texans are so ornery and independent, don't want any help, it's because of that. If you came to that and you weren't tough and independent, you died. I think a lot of our politics can be tied back to the land because it is very much a tough environment. Another thing, we talked about fire. I'm not going to really go into this too much, but this is a fire that we did on Warren Ranch several years ago. But the fire frequency, right, just like folks were saying, was very high. So in this area that's yellow, that fire frequency is every 1 to 3 years. It's very likely that this area burned very, very frequently. Sometimes because of Indians, sometimes because of lightning strikes. So there's a whole set of things that have changed in our world. And then there are things that were unintended, like I said. So we put out fires, and then we had things like this. Too many Aggies in here? Gonna hiss this, right? We had when the first settlers got to the greater Houston area, there were massive herds of Mustangs and Longhorns. How? Well, they'd become wild from other parts. There was a drop of Longhorns near the Texas-Louisiana border, or some cattle that evolved into Longhorns, and then they came up from the south. And so what I'm saying is, even before we had a chance to take a look at those prairies, the early naturalists in the 1830s and 40s and 50s that came through here and cataloged stuff and sent back stuff to Kew Gardens back in England, we already had European species like these here changing the land and changing the ecology. Okay? So there's a whole set of circumstances that we talk about when we talk about ecological restoration, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. Okay? And that's okay, because if you can't live with uncertainty, you'll probably go home. So if you take a look at the little sheets that I sent out, the pictures, let's do couple little activities real quick. See those little pictures, those time slices? So you should have like 7 of those time slices. And I gave you a set of them. So one of the things, as I teach in high schools or junior highs or elementary schools or whatever, one of the things your students really struggle with is this notion of a sliding baseline.
Do you have more than one step from here in that?
You should have an A, B, C, D, E. You should have all the way through H.
H. Yeah, they're there. Uh-oh. Somebody fell down and...
You have all of them? You got all of them? So here's the picture. Here's the deal. These are all a picture of the same place, the same neighborhood. Okay? Your job, and this is a real simple thing for you guys who are grown up, but you'd be amazed at how hard it is for some students. Put them in the order from oldest to youngest picture of that neighborhood. They're not alphabetical. That's what the kids want to do, but that's not what we do.
These are mastodons. That's megafauna in North America.
This is agriculture.
You're missing a picture. Let me get you one. Yeah. Here.
Is it over there, maybe? Which one do you think?
Do you have two?
Well, this is, there's suburban, and this is more suburban, just farm. The city is farther away.
All right, you got them?
It's for farming. This is farming.
Yeah, this is
Is this put on one of the websites?
Yes, that's on the Here in Houston website. That's called it's called Snapshots in Time.
Something at Cast recently.
Okay, guys, let's. Was it a cast? I think Rainey did it. A cast. Yeah. She asked me if I could do it, and she said, I said sure. So anyway, what's the oldest one? H. So yeah, Houston had exactly 0 dinosaurs, right? We're a marine system, right? But think about how each one of these impacts what we see on the land. Andy talked really well about those saline barrens and those salt domes. Okay? Think about the economy of Houston, oil. But also think about the surface expressions of these salt domes and how they change the specificity of the plant community. So things that happen in the Jurassic are still impacting the ecology that Andy has to deal with every day. That's kind of profound. All right, what comes next? Yeah, those mammoths come in. Now, if you don't think those mammoths were helping to change the genetics of the big blue stem that was around with them, and the little blue stem, and the switchgrass, they were changing the genetics of those plants. We're the inheritors of those mammoths in terms of the plant community that we had. Okay, so we go on, and then what comes next? Yeah, B, the kind of the bison, kind of Native American stage, and then it progresses. Right, longhorns come in, they start shifting things around. You know, if you there's a wonderful account. There's a wonderful new book called Pleasant Bend. And it accounts kind of the west part of Houston and how settlement happened there and what people found. There's great accounts of these huge, huge Mustang herds where the Galleria is today, back in the 1800s. Massive herds. Think about how they were influencing that plant community, okay? And also the animal community. And then comes the rancher stage, because they didn't really know what to do with the prairie. They were mostly farming the bottomlands of the rivers at that point. Then the steel plow came. And then bam, farming started to come in here. What kind of farming is going on there in that big slot?
G, you have, looks like row crops.
What kind?
Looks like corn or sorghum.
There's a clue there.
Irrigation.
Irrigation. And there are what
And there's also geese flying in the VO.
And there are, look on the far right side,
Right silos.
Oh, shotgun.
duck hunters. Okay? So you wouldn't really have the corn, the rice up and the duck hunting at the same time, but I had to kind of get it all in there. And then you get this sequence where rice becomes harder to farm because the equipment and the infrastructure move out. So this is a picture of just about any neighborhood in western Harris County. The sequence of the land. Okay, this is a primordial sequence in this area. But that's the thing, was when you have a project to do at your school, and people say, "What the hell are you doing planting this pocket prairie on campus?" What they think you're doing is you're planting something new and weird, and what you have to convince them is you're planting something old, ancient, and meaningful. Because people see that last picture and they assume that's what has been there. So most people assume that Houston was carved out of a giant forest or out of a giant swamp that had all water everywhere, you know, depending on the mythos that you buy it into. So you can kind of reassemble those and we'll move on. And we talked about how much prairie is left. Let me give you kind of a snapshot of that. Because we talked about, because this really figures into the conversation. So, you all have poker cards? All right, anybody have a pair of something?
There's extras if anybody needs it.
Oh yeah, we need to pass all those out, because they're exactly 100. Give extra to these people close around you. What we're going to pretend is that you're land barons, and you have just inherited, each one of these is 1% of the coastal prairie that was in this region originally in 1836. Actually 1820s, because that's when people settled this part of the world. So, anybody have a pair of something good? Anybody got 3 of a kind? Yeah, what do you got?
3 aces.
3 aces. Anybody else got something good? 3 kings. Oh man, he's just basic. Barely got you. You got 3 aces and 2 kings?
Yes.
Full house. Now let's see how well you do at prairie poker, David. Because what we're going to do now is we're going to assume that each one of those cards represents something. Okay? So, if I tell you this card, put it up in the air and we'll find out the plight of your land since the 1820s. Who's got a 2, 3, or 4? Hold it up. Now your goal is to hold on to as much prairie as you can, right? It's precious. All right, that's all under Chinese tallow, Johnson grass, Old World bluestem, lost. All right, who has a king, any king, or aces of hearts? Hold them up. Now, if you do this with kids, I will have to tell you that you'll have to explain the different suits to kids. They don't play as much poker as we did. Apparently, we grew up on pirate ships. Those are really good poker cards, but in fact, those are under concrete right now. Let's put those to the side. All right, who has a 5, 6, or 7? At 8, 9, or 10? A jack or a queen? Put them all to the side. Those are lost to agriculture or overgrazing. That was the biggest category. We think about houses being the big habitat loser, but until recently it was intensive agriculture. Okay. Who has ace of spades, clubs, or diamonds?
Ace of spades, clubs, or diamonds?
Yeah. All right, take a look. So this is really important here. So this is about the amount of prairie measured in 2010 that we think is restorable to a pretty decent quality given enough money, and that's always the kicker, is given enough money in the region, right? So that's not 100 cards, but that's about 5 or 6 cards. And that's tens of thousands of acres. That's a lot of acreage. Keep that number in mind. Who has the ace of spades? Here's the magic card. So when people are saying that there's only less than 1% of really high quality coastal prairie, in some areas there's only less than 1/10 of 1%. So which is the ink in the middle of that card. This is why we will pay $80,000 for an intact, never plowed, high functioning prairie like the Deer Park Prairie. Whereas we might buy a restorable but kind of rough patch of prairie for $3,000 to $4,000 an acre. That's the difference. Because we know that, as Andy was saying, we need those really great, high quality, what I call platinum, not pristine, because none of them are pristine, platinum pieces of prairie as blueprints. And it's a way of ecologists being trained on what to see and how to see, okay, as best we can. But here's the thing. If we have that little platinum prairie left, old growth prairies left, what are we to do? What are we going to do? Well, we could pack it up and cry. We could do that. But we recognize that there's great value in doing prairie restoration, so bringing prairies up to a higher standard where they can be, or reconstructing prairies altogether from whole cloth, which is what happened at Sheldon and is happening at the project I'm going to talk about at Indian Grass Preserve, and is what's happening when we put in these little pocket prairies. Now, that word prairie gets really kind of messy in that when I call a pocket prairie a prairie, some people get pissed at me because that's not a prairie. It's a naming convention, and it's a way of marketing. I'm not justifying it, and nor do I have to justify it from a scientific standpoint. They have a specific function. So in terms of this project, every time we go into a project, whether it's out in the country or in the city, we think about these four things. What are our goals? What are the ecological goals? How does it need to function? What is it going to function for? What is it going to help? The ecosystem services. What we might want to do is figure out how much water retention is it going to do. Especially for us at Katy Prairie, it's critical to substantiate our existence, that we're helping with flood control. Okay. Also, coming along the scene, we're very heavily involved in carbon sequestration talks in terms of selling credits. We want to make money to restore prairies. Also, what are our interpretive goals? How do we want to tell the story? What will telling the story get us in terms of more money to do more restoration? And the human connectivity. How do you actually connect people? So, and by the way, just real quick, I'm working on a book. This is one of the pictures from the book, these little flower vignettes. Hopefully, I'll have the manuscript in finally this year after bajillions of years of being behind. So anyway, in context, that's where we are, Katy Prairie Conservancy and our protected preserve system. There's been a lot of talk about the third reservoir. Okay, there's been talk about putting a berm around our land, which would really destroy its ecological function. So we're going to work with people as best we can on that. But long story short, we are upstream of everybody here. And that makes us really critical. Because during Hurricane Harvey, there was literally millions and millions of gallons of water sitting there on the prairie, not going into local streams real fast. So although, some folks have said, well, we had the Katy Prairie, but it didn't save us from Harvey. Yeah, but it could have been a hell of a lot worse. That's what people need to remember. That we can always make a bad situation really, really bad. Okay? So, in terms of where we work, one of the things that we've done over the last few years is we've helped to put in all these pocket prairies, and actually that isn't all of them. That's just about half of them. Okay, and the reason we're doing that is very, very simple. One is nobody knows what a prairie is. Okay, and if they don't know what a prairie is, guess what? They don't care. So we need to put them in very highly public places so people actually get to understand what that means. And I'll tell you how this played out for us one time. We had a donor that never gave us any money. One of our award-winning projects is the MD Anderson Prairie, along with MD Anderson Cancer Center. Her mom got sick, unfortunately, was being treated at Anderson. She went and hung out in the MD Anderson Prairie. She gave us a call. She goes, oh, I guess I get what you guys do. I understand. It was meaningful to her. How can we work together to get you some money? Okay, and we have started to see this over and over again, that both in terms of media accounts and in terms of donors, they need to see that people are active in their neighborhood, not just at a refuge in the middle of the rural environment. So when people say, oh, Jaime, you're wasting your time on all this crap here, this is the big ecology, and I'm using this as a hook to get money to do this, okay? And it is working. So also, we know now that we did some pollinator research over the summer that although these pocket prairies don't have the diversity of pollinators that some of our bigger prairies do, that in terms of sheer numbers, sometimes the density is higher because they have a concentrating effect in the city. And for common species, sometimes these are things that are helping to keep them going or expanding. Okay? So they're not ecologically worthless. In fact, the Anderson Prairie, which is like smack dab in the middle of the city, we just saw an American woodcock there 2 weeks ago. You know, I would have never assumed. When you assume in ecology, you're going to run into problems. So there's the Anderson. That's in the middle of the Texas Medical Center. This is Roadrunner Prairie. We're working in about 6 school districts at this point. There's Anderson from the top. And we know that these little things, when we talk about ecosystem services, right, they mean something. So we talk about the prairie being the hardest working ecosystem in our region. If you can give me another region that helps to grow cattle, provide foodways, sequester carbon, soak up water, provide biodiversity protection, give a sense of calm in the middle of the city, go ahead and show me that ecosystem. Because this is the most kind of hard-working ecosystem there is. There's another picture of a planting that we had there several years ago. But let's get to a bigger project in the rural environment, and that's what's happening at our Indian Grass Preserve. So, what you're looking at right there is a ghost. This was called the Psalms Road Prairie, and this is a beautiful patch of prairie near Psalms Road and the I-10 area on the western part of town. Now, we weren't able to save this thing. They wanted, what did they want? $10 million in a month? A little steep. Anyway, we organized a big rescue, and it was all good, except for the fact that this priceless little habitat was destroyed. But what it did do is it gave us an idea of what an intact prairie system on the Katy Prairie looked like. And this is something really important when you're doing reconstructions, you're starting to build something from scratch, is you have to have at least some notion of what a reference site would be. You know, if you want to look like a bodybuilder, you got to know what a bodybuilder looks like in order to even try to get there, right? So this was a muley, little blue stem. There's a lot of bushy blue stem in here, but if you really looked at it, it was muley and little blue stem dominated. And then it over it was just like Deer Park. It probably had over 300 species, although we didn't have a chance to catalog it all. It had saline barrens. It had the whole shooting match here. Beautiful. So we started off with this notion that we were never going to get to this because, first of all, there's not even 300 species commercially available of seeds and plants. Just not in this area. In places up north, there actually are, in like Wisconsin and parts of Minnesota. But here, we're going to deal with a subset of those plants. But we wanted to function a little bit like this as much as possible and to look a little bit like this. Okay? So, what were we dealing with? Well, we were dealing with a nasty piece of property, and Andy knows all about it because he went up and looked at it before the project and advised us and gave us some really great advice. What we had was a property that was once a prairie that had become a rice farm and was intensively rice farm for a while, and that does all kinds of things to the nutrient balance and the compaction and all kinds of stuff. But the clay layer had never been punctured, as far as we knew, in any major sort of way. But then it was flattened out and gridded and made into a fungicide and herbicide experimentation station for years. Roman Haas. And so what we inherited was a landscape that was not only denuded of its original potholes, hydrology, pimple mounds, but it also had an incredibly simplified plant community. I mean, if you went out here, there were probably, you could probably find 50 species, but not of any quantity. You'd probably find like 8 species that really dominated the whole thing. None of them were particularly magnificent, Many of them were exotic species, like this introduced rye. Very low diversity. So when you went out there, you did see bird life, you did see gophers, you did see other animals. It wasn't great. Okay? So what we wanted to do was we wanted to reintroduce some of the things that made this special. Most notably, the pothole community that was here originally, and then some of the plant species. And I'm going to kind of run through this because we don't have tons of time. But in terms of the hydrology, like other folks have pointed out, and you can see this on Google Earth, and you're really lucky if you live here in Harris County, because in most parts of the U.S., Google Earth does not go back to 1944. It only goes back to the 70s. Okay? We're just really lucky to have this tool because you can start to see the bones of the city. And this is not just in the Katy Prairie. This is like where the Astrodome was, all over the place. And like Andy, I spend a lot of time fantasizing that I'm walking through this stuff going, oh my God, what are we looking at here? And you get glimpses of this, in certain places. But that's all you get is glimpses. But we knew that we wanted to restore the pothole complex as best we could with modern engineering. So we took this 1931 aerial and we overlaid this map with this old aerial. And so what came out of this was kind of a hydrological compromise in terms of hydrology, so that we tried to find out where the old potholes were, do some exploratory digging, and but we had a trail system that was going on. So it's not a true recreation of all the potholes because there are outfall pipes that are going through here, frankly, to kind of move water in a more historic fashion. But we used earth-moving equipment, just like they did at Armand Bayou. And there's Andy right there.
At Sheldon.
What's that?
That was done at Sheldon.
Yes, exactly. We're using the same game plan. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. And so we got busy. First thing we did is we started putting up signage. This is actually after the project. We put up some signage, and then we started contouring this ground, and we took time-lapse photography of this. And it became very apparent very quickly that what we were starting to do was daunting, and that's because we opened the whole, what had been covered in vegetation, we opened the whole thing up to exotic seeds. I mean, we just laid this skin bare. And when we got done with this earth moving, I got to tell you, I had a moment of palpitation there. I was like, oh my God, this is all open, right? The idea was to do all this sculpting, come in here with seeds pretty quickly after that and start that. We had 3 floods in a row. Okay, it depends. Things get shifted back. So we had to do more, herbiciding than we wanted to, for sure. But once we had the bones of the place back, then, like I said, nature started to take hold. So this is the Memorial Day flood. This is the Tax Day flood here. And you can see there's a little pothole that we had put in. And to tell you the truth, with the wetlands, I know at Sheldon that they're growing out a bunch of plants and they're planting with volunteers, and it's awesome. One thing that we have seen is that because of all these floods bringing in seeds from everywhere and interconnecting wetlands, that we haven't really needed to bring in, that's what it looked like the next morning. We haven't needed to bring in a lot of seeds for the wetlands. It all came in by itself. There are a couple of species that we'd like to see, but those are all filled in at this point. Okay?
Quick question.
Yeah.
For the contour landing process, how long did that take?
That took a couple of months to get that right, because we had intermediate rainfall events and then it had to dry out. Actually, it probably took about 3 months because it was just it was playing havoc. The rain was playing havoc with us. But here's one thing that I will say, and this is going to be the sticky point, and I want Andy to cover his ears for this part. And this is where there's a big split in the prairie restoration community locally. When you want to get those seeds in the ground, you have to make a decision. And that decision is, let me put it this way. What we'd all like to do is use seeds that were hand collected by the angels and placed and cleaned into our hand. That's what we'd all like to do. Okay? That didn't happen, right? So what we do is we do a compromise. We harvest seeds locally. We purchase seeds from Native American seed. Now, if you think the Native American seed, and I love Native American seed, I work with them all the time. But they do grow, they do select species. If you grow row crops of certain species, you are evolutionary selecting for that. I don't care what you do. Okay, you have a stock, you grow it in blocks. It's selection. They'll tell you that it's kind of wild type because they got it from a wild population. But if you grow that for several years, you got a selection. Now because we were working with Wildlife Habitat Federation. This is where, and we're actually on this harvest right here. This is at the U of H Coastal Center. So we wanted max diversity, and we wanted to capture that. So we went to U of H Harvest. U of H Coastal Center did a special harvest at the peak ripeness, not of little blue stem, but of rattlesnake master. They used to do it for a little blue stem. So we probably got a good 35 to 40 species this way. And then we used some of this. So Bamford Seed Company is one of the biggest seed producers in the state. And what they have is they have a selection of kind of massively grown species. And what I mean by that is they take what are called NRCS releases. And so basically what happened is at some point in the past, the NRCS took a population, God knows where, it could be Kansas, it could be anywhere. They grew it up for specific characteristics. And one is to break seed dormancy very quickly. So grow up, produce very quickly, because prairie seeds are highly variable. And so what they do is those seeds are two things. One, they're cheap as dirt, relatively speaking. And two is they have very specific growth characteristics, but very, very narrow genetics. Oftentimes which are not well suited here. Which means that they'll either typically do one of two things. What would those two things do, Andy? One of those two things would be what?
They grow really fast. They germinate and grow and cover your site really fast.
They become a monster, which has happened for sure, or they don't do anything. What you're trying to do is, if you're going to use this, is to try to get species that you've used on other projects, small and monitored, such that they come up and they persist for a while and then go away. They don't flop immediately. So we did use 4 species, 4 variants here. Now we did not use Alamo switchgrass, which is a monster. We used 4 that had been used on a couple other projects that we did with Wildlife Habitat Federation. And true to form, they've come up, but they're already starting to peter out, which is good. That's what you want them to do. But in the intermediate time, what they did is they gave the place structure, and they reduced some competition from all the exotic species that totally surround this site. Okay, so this is a very, for those folks who just want to go local wild type versus this hybrid method, which is using local wild type supplemented by NRCS releases, I will say that I'm not sure if there's a right answer to that, but I completely understand both sides of that argument. And I've been on both sides of that argument. Okay. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect solution. What we knew is that the invasive species load around this project was hellacious. So if we let that all be bare dirt because everything was, all of our wild collected seeds were dormant, it would have been a mess. Okay. What we also did is we overseeded. We took the specs that we were given by Native American Seed and other folks, and we bumped that up because we needed coverage very quickly. We also did this because we wanted to hedge our bets. We spent about 10 grand getting 50 bales of hay cut from the Nash Prairie. Seed hay, not regular hay, but seed hay, full of native seeds that we couldn't get commercially, especially with these genetics. Hauled them all the way up, more than 50 miles up to where we were. And then we rolled them out. Here's the Sierra Club rolling this, and you talk about fun. We had kids doing this, and we wanted a lot of public engagement in terms of this, right? So we rolled it out, and we forked it out, and we put it all over the site as best we could. No doubt this would have also given us some microbes, but we probably had a pretty good, we actually did a total soil food web, and it was pretty good. And we know that everything grows on this thing, man. This thing is, it's old rice land, and it still grows really well. And then we started 2 gates of general public. So whenever you're doing a project like this, the worst thing you can do is do it all by yourself. Not only is it more work for you, but nobody will support it afterward because nobody had a hand in it. So we always try to build in the public support. So we do Putting Down Roots, was a big planting event just like Prairie Pandemonium. And that Putting Down Roots is a double entendre on purpose. We have people grow plants at home. It's part of the Great Grow Out. We give them seeds. Actually, we're having a seed packing party this month at the Houston Arboretum. We're going to get several groups together, pack a bunch of seeds so we can distribute them to volunteer growers. She's growing out Rattlesnake Master. She'll give those back to us. We'll raise them up in our nursery and then put them in the ground at one of our sites. And if you want to learn how to grow some plants, you can either hang out with Tom Solomon or see his virtual double. So we do have a series of videos that we shot many years ago that show you kind of how to grow native plants, and it's available on that Here in Houston website, the whole series there. And Tom did an excellent job of explaining what to do. Now, he's probably learned a heck of a lot more since that time. He's always tinkering. But if you use that methodology with many species, it'll be very successful. And then how do you measure success? And this is the real bugaboo. Because my computer doesn't work. When you're measuring success, you know, I think you have a confirmation bias just like you do with the news sometimes. You see what you want to see, okay? So you have to use, you know, transect. If you really want to do it right, you should do vegetational monitoring to see if you're hitting your restoration targets. Now, that being said, this is as much an art as it is a science. And so you can get a pretty good understanding of how it's working by looking, if you're experienced enough like Andy or Mark, walking through and seeing, feeling, really, it's kind of like the force, right? Feeling how it's responding. You know, so if you're seeing a lot of diversity coming up, if you're seeing a lot of patchiness, if you're seeing the water getting, you know, moving in the way that it is, you start to get a feeling for what it's like, and you can, you know, even if you're, I would couple the two, right? One thing that was fun is as soon as we dug these out, these started to sprout in the potholes. We had this whole wetland community that had been covered for decades, and it started to spring up. The first year we put this in, I don't know what's going on with my mouse, these guys showed up. There wasn't any vegetation on there yet. Those are American Avocets. Okay? Since we've dug those potholes, the last 4 times I've gone out there, bald eagles have been hunting those potholes. Okay? In the summer, spoonbills, wood stork. In the wintertime, sandhill cranes, mottled ducks, northern pintails, which are really in trouble. And this guy showed up. This is something none of us even thought. So in terms of this restoration stuff, what you're doing is trying to push nature in a certain way. You can't make her do anything. You just got to try to nudge her going. But she starts picking up steam and has her own trophic cascades and things start happening. This is called the crawfish frog. This is a species that's been in big decline across the U.S. It's probably going to be an endangered species here. 2 years after we initiated this project, this guy showed up. And now we have a population of these guys on that property. That's something I would have never forecasted, right? I didn't even know we had them out there. Crawfish frog. And then this last spring, something truly magical happened. I've been going to the Indian Grass Preserve for a long time. And because of the size of the place, you start to have size effects. And you see some cool stuff out there, I'm not going to lie. Even in the most beat up prairies, you see some cool stuff because of size and patchiness. But I had only seen maybe 1 firefly on that property. Now we have this intersection of those 3 sisters that Mark was talking about, the wetlands, the woodlands, and the grasslands. We had thousands of fireflies in the spring. It was amazing. We had a frog program, and we saw just bajillions of fireflies. Magic. So what did we do? Of course, you schedule a firefly event 2 weeks after that. We saw 1 firefly. That sucked. That was really bad. If you were seeing fireflies, what I kept on saying, what would happen is X. So basically we went from this to this to this to this to this. This was shot by drone last year. Now, in terms of maintenance and kind of furthering this project, because we're going to wrap up for lunch here. First of all, we've had a horrendously good response by wildlife. It's been amazing seeing the transformation. Seeing species that we never even came close to seeing on this property has been very exciting. Listening to it, just the soundscape has changed a lot in terms of what's there. These wetlands have filled in with a lot of plant material. You're starting to see patchiness. So we've already burned the site once. We'll probably burn it again this month. We plan on having it on about a 3-year rotation. The great thing about this project is it's got fire breaks all around it. You can light that sucker up and it's not going to go anywhere. I love it. But we will also flash graze this. So we do use cattle. And there is quite a bit of evidence, and this is another decision inflection point between ecologists, right? Do you use cattle or you don't use cattle? And then some people say, oh, cattle are always bad and don't use them, and you're going to lose this cluster of species. Some people are like, oh, you use cattle all the time, everywhere. And the truth is, what? It depends. It depends. What I will tell you, just from walking so many prairies in this area, is there's a weird phenomenon that happens. In larger prairie patches that are grazed, now they're not always grazed responsibly, well, sometimes they don't have a good stocking rate or a good rotation rate, to be honest with you. But a lot of those pastures, even though they might not be as rich botanically, the wildlife tends to be better. Now, I can explain why, but there's some research linking grazers and their physiology with responses to the invertebrate community and the insect community, and there's this fine web. Whereas sometimes I'll go to places like the Deer Park Prairie, which I love, helped save it. Magnificent botanic community, terrible wildlife community. UH Coastal Center, magnificent botanically, wildlife, it sucks. Okay? So I think that there is a place for cattle, and it does change the, I mean, if you think about this system evolving with grazers for, that many thousands of years, to say that we're going to take all the grazers off permanently and it's not going to have a huge impact, I don't know, how you get there. But you have to bring them in, graze it, and then take them off. You cannot leave them pinned in, or they will destroy the thing, and they will heavily degrade it. And that's where I totally agree with folks who are not for using cattle, is that if you don't manage the cattle properly, you will lose that prairie. So what we're going to do is we're going to have mobile hot wire fences in here, and we will run them in for a short duration, but high intensity short duration, and then get them the heck off to the next property.
What's a short duration?
It could be like just a couple days, 3 days, 4 days. I mean, it could be real quick. It depends on the size of the pasture and how big the paddocks are and all that stuff. But in an area like this, we'll have them go in there for a few days, move them off.
How many head?
I don't know yet, because we need to think about, this is not a, we typically think about, like on the ranch, like we'll have this many head for this many acres. But because we're kind of trying to redo the bison, it's a lot more head than would be on a normal pasture like this, and then get them off. So we'll have to calculate the rate. Yeah.
Regarding the type of grazer, I had heard that the buffalo doesn't clip the grass as close to the ground.
Andy, maybe we want to talk about...
Is that an urban legend? Or?
You might want to... I don't know if you know much about that. What I've read is that functionally, that they're not that much different. That we have a preconceived notion that bison are more whole foods. It's like better for it, yeah. But from the research I've seen, that if you manage cattle appropriately, they can have a lot of the same functional attributes. I don't know, Andy, if you've seen any of that.
The ice cream plant, their selection rather than how they dentition.
The selection is very similar, but cattle are evolved from wetland species, and they have a greater water need than bison do. So if you've got an area with, well, they can end up really hitting up on riparian community.
Oh, yeah.
Harder than bison would, because they hang out where the water is.
Right.
So ranchers typically, they'll manage that by putting in artificial water sources to spread the grazing out and about. There you go.
But that's a really excellent point. What we wouldn't want to do is, you know, we're looking at how to protect our riparian corridors better from cattle grazing, because they really have a bad function there. But these wetlands as well, you know, we need to be considerate of that in terms of when we turn them loose, right? We don't want them messing up the whole thing. So anyway, from a kind of a human connectivity standpoint, we've gotten some really, you know, great things. And one thing to point out is that any of these projects that get done, unless you're Ted Turner, you're going to need a heck of a lot of partners. There is nobody with all the skill sets that are needed to be able to pull off one of these things, because you're really putting together, like Andy was saying, you're trying to put back together a Rolls Royce. You need different pieces and different partners. Anyway, I know it's time for lunch. Do you have any questions for me before we take off? Or we stay here and eat or whatever?
Well, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
About what if recreating the hydrology and the total topography is not an option for you? What if your pocket prairie is very small and you must work within the confines of the school district and they don't allow me to operate heavy machinery?
Yeah. So
I have flat areas that have been grassland outside of a riparian border. Can I plant anyway? I mean,
sure.
I'm putting in mixes of grasses from native plant land and whatever grows.
Mm-hmm. No, I would say that anything is better than lawn, except concrete, literally. So lawns, just so that you guys, you know, so you're aware, is they've done studies on biological richness, and junkyards have higher biological indexes than lawns. They are garbage. I mean, they are garbage habitat. I mean, they are worthless. So what I would say in terms of water filtration and all these other ecosystem services, put some stuff in. And like, you know, a lot of people ask me, like, how big is a pocket prairie? Any size you want it to be. Now, if you're talking about a real prairie, then you start to get into size issues and whatnot. But if you want to put in a pocket prairie, think about this. Every species, on average, this is a total average, right? Every species of plants on Earth is supposed to support about 20 species of wildlife. Now, some don't support any, frankly. And then some, like green milkweed, they've accounted for 600 species that ultimately depend on that. So even if you have just a small area with 20 or 30 species, we're talking about the potential for several hundred species of mostly smaller wildlife being attracted there. And I'll tell you, I mean, I've gone to some of these pocket prairies. When we started that Prairie Builder Schools and Parks program, I thought, this is P.T. Barnum. I'm going to get these pocket prairies in highly visible places, get people to ask questions, we'll respond, we'll get them excited about prairies. Ecologically, The more I have spent time in these little things, the more kind of crazy the stuff I've seen in them. So I think that we don't really have a great answer for what the value is, but I do know that you will see things that will amaze you, and that's refreshing. Yes?
I'm curious, when you contoured the land, did you attempt to recreate NEMA mounds?
No, because and Andy knew this from his project, a lot of times what they would do out there is they would push the pothole, the NEMA mounds into the potholes, and then it would all get mixed up through agriculture and everything. So it wasn't, did you guys recreate NEMA mounds at all, or try that at all?
Yeah. A better idea is what his name. Just go out and buy some.
Oh,
So they're clearing off a piece of land
right.
now, and I'm like, just go buy it because it's a very specific soil type.
Yeah.
Very uniform soil type. You dig down those NEMA mounds, it's absolutely uniform. So when somebody's destroying a piece of prairie, go buy the dirt, haul it off. They did that at the park.
They did that at Seaborn Creek Park.
Yes.
They took a NEMA mound from Deer Park, they transplanted it and just lumped it, and everything came up out of it. It's really amazing. So no, we didn't try the NEMA mounds, but we do have some upper and lower areas, but it's nothing like that.
One more question is about grazing.
Mm-hmm.
I may be way off the mark, but I'm just curious. Can you experiment with other types of grazers, like goats, and get a similar, because they're smaller and maybe they don't compact as much, and maybe you need twice or 3 or 10 times as many goats?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Andy knows the answer to that. Now, I will say this in terms of cattle grazing. So we have cattle that graze some of the most sensitive habitats we have in the Katy Prairie, those saline barrens. And they create little micro topographies that collect water and do other things. And so they create a lot of patchiness. And I think that's part of the reason why when we use grazers and fire and mowing and haying and this and that, what you're wanting to do is create patchiness. Okay? Because a uniform stand, treated uniformly all the time, you start to select. So the U.S. Coastal Center is a great example of that. Beautiful liatris. It's a pretty uniform stand of stuff because they've mowed it every year. Same thing, same treatment. And what we know is that those fires, the droughts, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, all of these disturbances, aperiodic, stochastically, is what creates the variation. And when you have lots of habitat variations, some shorter areas, some taller areas, that kind of thing, some saline barrens, that's when you start to get that wildlife richness. So, the cattle have a function, and as they move through the system, they create different kinds of microtopographies too. So, yes, all right. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.